This evening our study is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 20, verses 1 through 16, the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And let's begin with just a reading of the parable. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you." And so they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing. And he said to them, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" And they said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You go into the vineyard too." And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first." And when those hired about the 11th hour came, he gave each of them a denarius. Now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. On receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I gave to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me, or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first last." In some respects, this is a difficult parable. Some regard it as a marvelous parable about the grace of God, about God's extraordinary forgiveness and grace. Some have called it the gospel in a nutshell. Others hear those statements and they regard that as a bit of hyperbole. In fact, one scholar who's written a commentary on the parables, it's about that thick, it's the most comprehensive one I've ever seen, describes this as one of the in his opinion, one of the 3 most difficult parables to really understand. He would argue that some interpreters want it to say more theologically than it does. It is a parable that only occurs in Matthew's Gospel. And one of the first things that comes up for the Greek scholars in Matthew 20:15, it says, in the ESV, "Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me, or do you begrudge my generosity?" Literally what it says in the Greek is, "Your eye evil because I am good." The old idea of the evil eye. And in the context of that time and culture, evil eye is an expression of envy or stinginess. And so what the master is asking is not, do you begrudge my generosity so much as, does my generosity arouse envy in you? Which really gets to the heart of what the parable is all about. The picture of the parable is realistic but exaggerated. As the story is told, this owner would be reasonably well off, but not extremely wealthy. Not wealthy to the extent that he would leave all of the business of bringing in the crop in the hands of his overseer. He's personally involved. And so we're talking about somebody who we'd regard as sort of a comfortably well-off upper middle class person, not an extremely wealthy man who just leaves the running of the of the vineyard to hired hands. So he's not out there harvesting the grapes, but he's not just, you know, taking his ease back at the house either. He's directly involved in what's going on. The picture of someone hiring day laborers from the market at that time is a very realistic picture, as is the wage paid, a denarius a day. The number of people hired and the way they are hired right up to the last hour is exaggerated. You know, no owner of a vineyard would do what this man does in the way he does it. First of all, he'd have a better idea of how many laborers he would need. He wouldn't miscount so dramatically how many he needed. You know, he would have probably hired all he needed at the beginning of the day, or if not, maybe once during the day he'd figure that things were not going as fast as they could, and he'd go back to the market and get a few more. But unless the vineyard is right next to the marketplace, just the time allowed going back and forth, especially for the people hired at the last hour, you know, it makes that part of the story unrealistic, which is not a problem if you remember how parables are supposed to be understood. It's a story that is crafted to make a point. It doesn't have to be realistic. It can be exaggerated, and many of the parables are. It's a device. You know, just like people tell stories to amuse. You know, if you're telling a funny story, you may exaggerate the characters just to make it a little more funny. That's perfectly appropriate. A denarius, well, let me back up. The life of a day laborer was about as low as you could get in first century Judea. In many ways, their lot in life was worse than slaves. Now you might think, well, at least they have their freedom. Well, think about it. Slaves were expensive. Somebody who bought a slave made a major capital investment in that slave. Now, thank God we don't have slavery today. But if you buy an expensive piece of machinery to do the work that a slave would have done at an earlier time in history, you're putting out a significant capital expenditure. You don't leave that piece of equipment out in the rain. You don't run it till the engine is out of oil. You've got a big investment, so you want to take care of it. You want to make sure that it's kept in good working order. If you own slaves in the first century, you've got a big capital investment. You want to make sure they get enough to eat. You may not feed them good, you know, particularly delicious food or expensive food, but you want to make sure, just as, you know, and from the idea of a slave owner, they would look at this in the same way they would a workhorse or a mule. You make sure that the animal is fed and protected from the weather and is taken care of. So, if you've got a slave, no matter what's going on, you're going to make sure that he is fed, that he is sheltered, that he is protected from the elements enough that he can stay healthy enough to do whatever it is you bought him to do. But if you're talking about day labor, you've got no investment in him except one day's wages. Whether it is enough for him to live on, whether it's enough for him to support his family on, whether it's enough to see him through the next day, you know, that's totally irrelevant to you. So if there is a limited amount of work and there's enough to keep your slave busy for 3 days, but not all week, on the days he's not working, you're still going to feed him. But if it's day labor, when the work runs out, you stop paying him. And so for day laborers in the ancient world, they lived on the edge of starvation most of the time. And one denarius was the typical pay for a day laborer for a day's work. It was barely enough to keep body and soul together. You did not save money working for a denarius a day, even if you worked 7 days a week. And if you had very many family members that you were providing for, it was often not enough. And so the situation for the day laborer was desperate. In a normal economic situation, when people are hiring day laborers, if they hire them for the day, they pay them a denarius. If they hire them for half a day, they pay them half that amount, and so forth. The problem is, if you didn't get a whole denarius, then you didn't eat enough that day. The work day was typically about 12 hours, sunrise to sunset. And the poverty of these day laborers was so obvious that in the Torah it required that they be paid at sunset the day they worked, because in all likelihood they would need that money to buy enough food to eat that night and the next morning before they went back out in the fields. So they were living from hand to mouth, quite literally. As we look at this story and how it has been interpreted, not surprisingly, there's centuries of examples of the church, various interpreters trying to turn this into an allegory. And I'm not even going to go through all the different theories about how it is an allegory, because frankly it's a discredited way of dealing with parables. I'm not going to waste my time with it. Many think the parable portrays God's gracious generosity, the grace of God in salvation, and that it is an argument against salvation by works. Some think the parable is directed against envy, greed, boasting, or any kind of reckoning among Jesus' disciples. So let's, and there's some other theories that I'm not even going to waste your time with, because they're not worth my time or yours. One of the problems that we encounter with this parable is that human perceptions on ranking frankly, God just stands them on their heads. The way we judge, the way we categorize others, the way we position ourselves against others in some kind of formal or informal ranking, all of those human attempts to determine who's on top, God just kind of laughs at. And in this parable, we see God laughing at our attempts to categorize ourselves. Matthew indicates that the parable was addressed to the disciples and to the problem of envy. And that makes good sense, especially in the context. Look at this parable. Just before, we've got the story of the rich man, the rich young ruler, as he's called. Just after, over in verse 20, we have the mother of the Zebedee brothers, James and John, coming to Jesus and asking that her boys be seated in places of prominence when Jesus comes into his kingdom. I mean, the brass this woman had. You know, when you set up your throne, I want one of my boys on the right and one of my boys on the left. And though it doesn't say in the text, I suspect that she said, and it's James I want on this side and John I want on this side. You know, it's almost like a caricature of an interfering Jewish mother. And so this is the context that this parable is placed in. This idea of reward, this idea of position, this idea of honor. Remember what Peter said to Jesus in another context when he said, we've given up everything. What's in it for us? And Jesus said, your reward will be great. But he doesn't explain on what basis the rewards are going to be issued. If one of the questions that interpreters struggle with in this parable is, who is the target here? Who is the parable addressed to? Some would argue that it was addressed to Jesus' enemies, that his opponents are the intended audience, and the parable emphasizes that Jesus' acceptance of tax gatherers and prostitutes and other sinners was perfectly all right. That as the Son of God, he could choose his friends however he wanted to. That it wasn't for somebody else to tell him who he could accept or who he could forgive. And in that case, the parable is attacking the arrogance, the ideas of superiority of one over another in the kingdom. The most common view is that the parable is a picture of the grace of God to sinners. And often this comes with rather exaggerated descriptions of God being extremely generous. While the parable is about the goodness of God at some level, it is not contrasting works and grace. It's not about God's extreme generosity. No one in the parable receives the gift of grace. Every one of these workers worked for what they got. Some worked all day long in the hot sun. Some worked half a day. Some worked a few hours. Some worked for barely an hour. But they were all being paid for work accomplished. So to try to make the parable into a story about salvation as a gift of grace, really, you got to really distort what it says to come out with that meaning. If generosity were the focus, then the wage of all the workers would have been extravagant. So the guys who worked all day long, they wouldn't have gotten a denarius, they'd have gotten a bag of gold. Again, parables exaggerate for effect. And so they would all got a whole bunch more than they had earned. Some would have worked longer for it, but they would have all been paid way more than they could possibly have deserved. But that's not the way the story reads. Some of these guys got exactly what they had signed on for. Think about the parable of the unforgiving servant. Now there you see, the idea of somebody getting something above and beyond what they had earned. We don't have that here. What we have in the owner's action is not, it is more charitable than generous. He's giving them, some of the men, more than they had earned. But, so the meaning here is not a comparison of grace to works as a means for salvation. The parable's focus is not it's not on an existence not based on merit. It's not about the equality of all people or the need for solidarity among humans. It's not showing the equal value of those converted late in life compared to those who became Christians early. Again, if you try to turn this into an allegory, and then you say, well, Pastor Land became a Christian when he was 8 years old, and we've got other people who became a Christian just a few years ago. And so, if we try to put that as an explanation for the parable, then we're saying, well, whether you get saved as a child or saved on your deathbed as an old man, your reward is going to be the same. Again, you're reading, if you try to make it say that, you're reading stuff into the parable that's not there. The parable focuses on the goodness of the owner and the complaint, the envy of those who thought they should get more for their work. The parable instructs us that God's treatment of people, His judgment, is not based on human reckoning and human standards of justice. God is not bound by your definition of justice. That's what the parable is saying. Now you think about it. In our society, a fundamental definition of justice in the workplace is equal pay for equal work. That's pretty basic. I mean, if you are hired to do a job and somebody in the next cubicle is hired to do the exact same job, and you both have comparable educations, and you both have comparable work experience, and you're both hired on the same day, and you're both working the same hours, and he's getting paid $5,000 a year more than you are, your sense of justice is going to be outraged, and rightly so. One of the big points of emphasis in the last several decades has been the demand on the part of women to get equal pay for equal work compared to men. And it is a very legitimate call for basic justice. We understand that. We're not seeing basic justice in this parable. Not as you and I define justice. Those who worked less should be paid less. But the owner gives all the same wage because without it, and here's the important thing to remember, had he not done so, those hired late would not have had enough to eat. They wouldn't have had subsistence living. Out of God's sense of justice, out of God's sense of mercy and grace, He gave them more than they had earned just so they could get by. As humans, we're constantly comparing ourselves one to the other, and we're assessing how, whether or not everybody's being treated fairly. The only fact that caused the workers hired at the beginning of the day to get upset was the fact that the people hired at the end of the day got paid as much as they did. As with most humans, justice in their eyes is that which gives no one else, not even the poor, an advantage. It's a self-centered perspective. For most of us, injustice is what happens to our disadvantage. What happens to our advantage is just good luck. So, if we get a lucky break, we're happy. If our neighbor gets a lucky break, well, that's not fair. A couple weeks ago, some guy over in Madison Heights won $2.5 million in the lottery. He didn't earn that money. Why should he get that money? Why couldn't that happen to me? You know, I had a high school teacher, Joyce will remember him saying this, Ralph Barham. He used to say in class that people would rather hear that their neighbor's house burned down than that they won $1 million. And you know, old Ralph Barham, he was a little nuts in some respects, but he was right on that one. That is human nature at its ugly reality. We can feel sorry for the neighbor who has some bad luck, and in the process actually feel good about ourselves because we're being so compassionate. But if our neighbor has undeserved good luck, then we're just sitting there thinking, well, boy, you know, some people get all the breaks. Why can't I ever catch a break? That's what we're seeing in this parable. We're seeing people who got what they deserved, who got what they agreed to. You know, the owner of the vineyard wasn't treating them shamefully. You know, they weren't expected to do something they weren't being paid for. They got exactly what they reckoned on. And their only beef is that somebody else got a lucky break that they didn't get. And they're all in a snit about it. The rule of, well, in parables, one of the keys to reading parables, always look for any special emphasis at the end of the parable, because it's usually significant. Often the way these things are crafted, there is an important point made right in the very last sentence or two. That in stress rule comes to play in this one. Because at the end, we're focused on two facts. The evil eye of the complainers, their envy, and the goodness of the owner. Again, an evil eye is descriptive of envy, jealousy, lack of generosity. In Proverbs 28:22, it links an evil eye with greed. And Proverbs 22:9 says that the person with a good eye gives his bread to the poor. The owner is good because he gives to the poor, and the workers complain because they're jealous. It's really that simple. With this, the statement that one is good in 1917 takes on a new light. God is good because, unlike the rich young ruler, he gives to the poor. Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom includes metaphors for judgment and discussion of reward. Reward is not a bad motive. Now, modern Christians kind of get tripped up on this. You will sometimes hear people put down or hear people sort of try to distance themselves from any talk about rewards. It's like I'm just simply too spiritual to be taken in by promise of rewards. You know, I don't need a mansion in heaven. Just give me a little cabin over in the corner and I'll be happy. I mean, I'm just not, I'm not impressed with this promise of rewards. Well, that's absolute nonsense, and you know it. We're not being honest when we talk like that. If we weren't concerned about rewards in the future, then we wouldn't save money for retirement. We wouldn't be worrying about the stock market this week as our portfolio goes up and down. Sure, we're interested in rewards. And when you talk about eternal rewards, well, now we're talking about something really important. And Jesus talks about rewards. He emphasizes their importance. In no place does he say, don't give any thought to rewards. Quite the opposite. He says, my faithful servant will receive great rewards in heaven. So desiring reward is not a bad motive. When Peter asked in chapter 19, verse 27, what do we get for following? He was assured the reward is great. But, and here's what the parable helps us to grasp. The promise of reward does not create status and rank. That's where the Zebedee boys were way off base, as was their mother. This idea that somehow they deserved a higher rank, a higher position. The key in interpreting the parable is in verse 10. What's it say? Now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. Those hired first thought they would receive more. The parable breaks any chain of logic connecting reward, work, and human perceptions of what is right. God's judging is not regulated by your perception of justice. And lurking behind that is a whole theology of mercy. It is mercy. It is compassion that motivated the vineyard owner to pay these laborers more than they had earned. The parable is not attempting to say anything about human effort in salvation. Rather, just as no one should begrudge a good man who goes beyond justice and gives to the poor, so no one should begrudge God's goodness and mercy if God's rewards were limited to strict calculation. Implicit is the assumption that God's judgment will be contrary to our expectations. God doesn't operate by our rules. Also implicit in the parable is the fact that envy, displeasure at someone else's success, is contrary to the kingdom of God. Now, when you really start unpacking this and its implications, please hear me, what I'm saying is hypothetical. I'm not talking about any specific person or even any specific church. But one of the things that I have observed in church life over 40 years in ministry is we have a tendency to be so worried about how we are perceived and how we are how our efforts are received by others that it absorbs a great deal of our time. And so we're very conscious of whether or not the solo that I sang was well thought of, or the lesson that I taught that people enjoyed it, or the instrument that I played, that I did a good job, or that the meal that I prepared everybody was impressed with. So we have this undercurrent of constantly worrying about how our efforts, how our gifts, how our contribution is perceived by others, while at the same time acting with a false modesty when somebody says something complimentary about what we've done, and we say something, oh well, it was nothing, or I could have done so much better. We put ourselves down. Often when we've done a good job, And when in our hearts, we know we've done a good job. So what we're doing is lying out of a misplaced sense that that is how humility is reflected. You know, we don't want to be bragging about ourselves. The problem here is not whether we did a good job or a bad job, or whether we think we did a good job or a bad job. The problem is that our focus is on what we did. You know, we're not looking any further than our hands. The goal of mature Christian living is to be so Christ-centered, so focused on God and His glory, so focused on the needs of the rest of our Christian body, that we can celebrate equally the good job that we did in our solo in the choir, or the good job that the soprano down at the end of the line did in her solo in the choir. And be just as grateful and just as pleased with one as we are with the other, because we're not focused on what we did, we're focused on God for whom we did it. And folks, I don't know of anything that has been harder for me to pound through the heads of hard-headed Christians in 40 years than that simple truth. We got to quit thinking about us. Or as Rick Warren put it in the first page of his best-selling book, it's not about you. And when you can go into Christian ministry, whether it's vocationally or as a volunteer, with that kind of an attitude, then when you do something and it is, you know it's done well, and somebody says, I was so blessed by what you did, you can just simply smile and say, thank you, I enjoyed doing it. And that's not bragging. That's not boastful. That's simply speaking the truth with love. The guys in the parable certainly had not learned that lesson, because they're all focused on them. They're focused on their reward, on what they thought they had coming. To find our right place in the kingdom of God, all thoughts of jealousy and rank and privilege have to be jettisoned. There's no room for it. The obvious place where our thinking must engage with this parable is with issues of envy, justice, and goodness done to others. Have you ever wondered why goodness is so often the occasion for anger? Why do we find it so difficult to rejoice over the good that enters other people's lives? Why do we spend our time calculating how we've been cheated? You know, it's one thing to get upset because something awful has happened. We've had firsthand experience about that today. But to get upset when something good happens to someone is kind of inconceivable. And yet it happens every day. Somebody else's child gets a big scholarship to the university. Our child didn't get it. Instead of celebrating the other's good fortune, we're saying, well, you know, when I compare what classes their kid took and the ones that my kid took, I think that other kid was kind of skating. You know, he was avoiding the tough classes in order to keep his GPA up. My son, you know, he took the tough classes and he ended up getting a a B plus instead of an A, and that messed up his 4.0. That's the way we operate. Life in God's kingdom is focused on communal love, which we cannot experience as long as we're comparing ourselves with one another and calculating what is due us or being envious of what happens to others. Even while we speak of justice, none of us is satisfied with average. We all think we deserve just a little bit more. You know, it's kind of like you're a fan of Garrison Keillor, Lake Wobegon, everybody's above average. Where it really gets tough is when we use justice as some kind of a cold standard by which the poor are kept poor. We worry about justice, but too often we dress up as justice what is in reality jealousy or a weapon that limits generosity. Nor is justice some passive idea that is waiting to be violated. Justice in the Bible is a positive good. It's something that is actively seeking the good of other people, especially the poor. You cannot read the prophets in the Old Testament and escape the reality that God has a special interest in the welfare of those most in need in our society. In the Old Testament world, it was the poor, the widows, and the orphans. And the list isn't that different today. The poor we certainly have. 30-something% of the population of Lynchburg lives below the poverty level. That's a shockingly high number. I have never in my life lived in a community where such a high percentage of the people were poor. It's taken me some getting used to. And where the contrast between the very poor and the very wealthy was so dramatic. Likewise, we don't talk so much about widows today because thankfully in this day and age it is far less common for wives, young wives especially, to be widowed. People don't die as early as they used to, but in the same numbers. But when you look at the statistics of single women, especially single mothers, the percentage living in poverty is shockingly high. We got a lot of people divorced in our culture. And in vast majority of cases, the woman is the one who comes out on the short end of the stick economically. And as I read my Bible, I think for us to, where it says widow in the book of Amos, it's legitimate for me to read the single mother. I don't think we're doing injustice to Scripture by looking at it that way. The point is, those who, because of the circumstances of their life, are in chronic, constant need. And that's who this vineyard owner helped. The men who lived on the edge, who lived from hand to mouth, who had to have the pay they earned that day when they left to go home that night, or they wouldn't eat. The people living on the very edge of hunger. And God demonstrates in the parable that he has not only a passion for those people, but that as he defines justice, he provides it for them. And we have to come to terms with the fact that human justice and divine justice sometimes don't look much alike. Questions or comments? We have one more parable in this 4-parable set on discipleship. Next week we will be talking about the tower builder and the warring king in Luke chapter 14, verses 28 through 32. Let's close in prayer. Holy Father, as we contemplate what this powerful parable teaches us about mercy and justice, may we take it to heart. May it affect the way we look at our neighbors. May it affect the way we treat them. May it affect the way that we think about issues of public policy as these issues come into play. Thank you for giving us your word. And again, we lift up our hearts in prayer for compassion and mercy on those who have been so hurt by this terrible crime today. In Jesus' name.